back to beyoungministry.blogspot.com, to another blog, to another podcast access through the Be Young Ministry YouTube channel. Today we're in John chapter 12, verses 17 through 24, which reads, "Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, 'See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him.' Now, there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. 'Sir,' they said, 'we would like to see Jesus.' Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, 'The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I say to you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds.'" That's John chapter 12, verses 17 through 24. In our text for the day, the Lord Jesus is at a zenith. He's at his popular spot. The whole world seemed to want to see him because he had raised Lazarus from the dead. Wouldn't you want to see him if you'd seen him raise somebody who had been dead for 4 days? This kind of word spreads fast. So he was so popular that some visiting Greeks to Jerusalem went to Philip and Andrew requesting to see him. This request underlines the fact that the Lord Jesus was popular. But this kind of popularity repulses the Lord Jesus. This kind of popularity isn't high on his list. And even though he came to be the king, he didn't come to be the king that was expected by these gathered in Jerusalem. In fact, by the end of this week, their praises turned to crucify him. In verse 23, we read, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." This is the first time the Lord Jesus has gone along with the people's desire to acknowledge him as such. Several times in this gospel, we have heard Jesus say, "My hour has not yet come." These responses give clear indication that he was in utter subjection to the will of his Father in heaven. In verse 24, we get the explanation for his acceptance of the people's adulation. He goes on to utter words introduced by what I have described as the formula of focused attention. "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I say to you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." Of course, he is talking about himself. He is the grain of wheat. Unless he is willing to die, unless he goes to the cross, his whole purpose in coming to earth will have been wasted. And we will remain alone. If he dies, he produces many seeds. These Greeks, perhaps, represent the many seeds, converts with changed hearts and minds. The Lord Jesus is that grain of wheat. To realize its purpose, the seed must be planted. It has to be left in the cold, dark earth. In time, a green sprout will appear, then the blade, then the plant, then the stem, and finally the head. Then the harvest. On the cross, he accomplished something no one else could have. He conquered sin and death so that we could be reunited to God. Had the Lord Jesus not embraced death on that cross, we would have not been redeemed. The word redeem means to buy out. The term was used specifically in reference to the purchase of a slave's freedom. The application of this term to Christ's death on the cross is quite telling. If we are redeemed, God has purchased our freedom, and we are no longer in bondage to sin or to the Old Testament law. We don't have to measure up. We don't have to earn God's favor. In the Old Testament, redemption involved deliverance from bondage based on the payment of a price by a redeemer. The Hebrew root word includes a substitution required for the person delivered from the bondage of another. According to the New Testament, deliverance of mankind from its state of alienation from God has been accomplished through the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus. In the New Testament, redemption requires the payment of a price, in this case, the shedding of his blood. Mankind is held in the bondage of sin, from which only the atoning death of Jesus Christ can liberate. Redemption is the promise of God to deliver us from the power and the presence of sin. I should add the penalty as well. The penalty was absorbed by the Lord Jesus as God judged sin in his body as he hung on that tree. Before sin entered the world, Adam and Eve had an intimate relationship with God. But now, mankind has forfeited that relationship by choosing to reject God. The good news is that the Lord Jesus has purchased our redemption through his death on the cross by dying like a kernel of wheat. James Montgomery Boyce tells the story of a young Russian, the son of a close friend of Tsar Nicholas, who was caught stealing from the Tsar. As treasurer of a border fortress of the Russian army, the young man was to manage the Tsar's money and dispense the wages to the troops. But he began gambling and trying to cover his losses by borrowing from the army treasury. One day he heard that a government auditor was coming to examine the books. He sat down and added up what he had taken. It was a huge amount. He emptied out his own resources, subtracted it from what should have been in the account, and noted the great discrepancy. Under the amount due, he wrote, quote, "A great debt who can pay," end quote. He couldn't, and he knew no one could help him. So he drew his revolver and decided to kill himself at midnight. But as he waited for the clock to strike midnight, he fell asleep. And while he slept, Tsar Nicholas paid a surprise inspection visit. He saw the books, the despairing note, and the revolver, and he realized that the young man had betrayed his trust. But rather than arrest the young man, he had mercy on him. He stooped and wrote something next to the man's note and quietly left. When the young man awoke, he again picked up the gun and was about to pull the trigger when he noticed something. Next to his note was this note, quote, "A great debt who can pay," end quote. Next to that note was a single word written by Nicholas, and the word was Nicholas. And the next morning, a bag of coins arrived from Nicholas that covered the exact amount owed by the young man. In like manner, our debt was steep, much steeper than this young man's. We faced an eternity apart from God and all that is good. But while we were yet sinners and enemies of God, Christ died for us. My friend, I trust you have believed in the Lord Jesus and received his free gift of redemption. In addition, I trust these podcasts and these blogs are helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If I could be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at beyoungministry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great